You really want to do this here? The voice came low and controlled, but there was a hard edge beneath it, the kind that carried across open air without needing to be loud. And still the young lieutenant didn't hear it. Or maybe he did and chose not to, because his hand stayed firm on the old man's arm, fingers tightening just enough to assert authority as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, heat rising in soft waves from the concrete, while a distant rotor thumped somewhere beyond the hangars, steady. Indifferent, the old man stood still, not resisting, not explaining, his posture relaxed in a way that didn't match the situation. Like he had all the time in the world, like none of this mattered. His clothes were plain, worn denim, and a faded green jacket that had seen better decades. Nothing about him fit the sharp lines and pressed uniforms surrounding him, and that was exactly the problem. Lieutenant Ryan Brooks had already made up his mind. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time," he said, voice clipped, rehearsed. "This area is restricted. If you don't have clearance, I'll have to escort you off base." The words came out clean, professional, but underneath them sat something else, something impatient, something dismissive, because to him, this was simple, an old man in the wrong place, a minor disruption before a scheduled inspection, nothing more, nothing worth slowing down for. But the old man didn't answer. His eyes drifted past Brooks, not in defiance, not in confusion, just observing, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. The wind shifted slightly, brushing against a row of flags near the perimeter fence, their fabric snapping once, sharp and brief, and somewhere off to the side, Sergeant Daniel Hayes noticed it. Not the flags, not the wind, but the stillness, the way the old man held himself, steady, grounded, like he had stood in places where noise didn't matter and movement meant everything. Hayes had seen that before, not often, not in years, but enough to recognize it when it stood right in front of him. Brooks, on the other hand, saw none of it, his attention fixed on procedure, on control, on resolving what he believed was a simple breach. "Sir, last warning," he said, tightening his grip just slightly. And that was when Hayes caught sight of something small near the old man's side, half hidden by the fold of his jacket, a worn leather pouch, edges frayed, surface cracked from time, nothing official, nothing issued, but it didn't belong here. Not like that. Not on someone who looked like they didn't belong at all. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Hayes felt a weight settle in his chest, subtle but undeniable, like a memory just out of reach, like a warning he couldn't yet name, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, just sits there until you either listen or regret not doing it later. Lieutenant Brooks let out a slow breath, the kind that signaled the end of patience, and shifted his stance, boots grinding softly against the concrete as he prepared to follow through. But the old man still did not move, did not argue, did not even acknowledge the tension tightening around him. And that silence began to stretch, thin at first, then heavier with each passing second, until it pressed against the edges of the moment in a way that made it hard to ignore. Sergeant Hayes stepped closer, not enough to interfere, just enough to see more clearly, and his eyes settled on the old man's hands, steady, relaxed, no tremor, no hesitation, the kind of stillness that did not come from age alone. It came from experience, from repetition, from having stood in places where reacting too quickly meant making things worse. Hayes swallowed, something in his instincts shifting from mild concern to something sharper, something that told him this was not a routine situation, not even close. "Lieutenant," Hayes said carefully, keeping his voice level, "maybe we should verify with command before we escalate." Brooks did not even look at him, his attention locked on the man in front of him. "There is nothing to verify," he replied, tone firm, almost dismissive. "He is out of place, and I am handling it." The words landed clean, but Hayes felt the weight behind them, the need to be right, the need to maintain control, and that was when the wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint smell of jet fuel and warm metal, a reminder of where they stood and what this place represented. The old man's gaze followed that shift, just slightly, his eyes narrowing by a fraction as if something distant had caught his attention, something familiar, something remembered. Hayes noticed it, that tiny change, and it unsettled him more than anything else so far, because it was not confusion, it was recognition, quiet and immediate, like someone hearing a song they had not heard. in decades, and knowing every note without thinking. Hayes took another step back, pulling his phone from his pocket with a motion so subtle it barely registered, his thumb hovering over the screen for a fraction of a second before he made the call, not through standard channels, not through the usual layers, but directly, because something told him there was no time for delays, no room for assumptions. The line connected faster than he expected, a clipped voice on the other end, sharp, attentive. Hayes kept his words low, controlled, describing only what mattered: location, situation, the man. And then there was a pause, brief but heavy, followed by a single question that made Hayes straighten slightly. "Describe him again." Hayes glanced up, eyes moving over the old man once more, the worn jacket, the steady posture, the quiet presence that seemed to anchor the entire space without effort. And when he repeated it, the line went silent for a heartbeat longer than it should have. Then the voice returned, different now, tighter, more focused. "Do not let him leave." The call ended without another word. Hayes lowered the phone slowly, a cold realization settling in his chest as he looked back at Lieutenant Brooks, who was already shifting his grip, ready to act, unaware that something far above his rank had just been set in motion, and the old man remained exactly where he was, unmoved, as if he had known all along that the moment would turn, not with force, not with resistance, but with something far quieter and far more decisive. Lieutenant Brooks shifted his grip again, more deliberate this time, his patience thinning into something sharper as the seconds stretched. "Sir, you are not giving me a choice," he said, voice firm, projecting authority that felt solid to him, practiced and earned. But the old man finally moved, not away, not in resistance, just a slight turn of his head, enough to look directly at Brooks for the first time. And there was no challenge in that look, no anger, only a quiet clarity that made Brooks hesitate for a fraction of a second. He could not explain. As if he had just stepped into a conversation he did not understand, the air seemed to tighten around them, the distant hum of engines fading into the background as smaller details pushed forward, the faint creak of leather from the old pouch at the man's side, the soft flutter of fabric from the flags, the subtle shift of weight in boots nearby. As other personnel began to notice the standoff, Sergeant Hayes watched closely, his pulse steady, but his mind moving faster now, replaying the voice from the call, the pause, the instruction: do not let him leave, not detain, not question, just hold position. And that difference mattered more than anything. "Lieutenant," Hayes said again, quieter this time, but firmer, "we should wait." Brooks exhaled through his nose, irritation breaking through the surface. "For what?" he replied, not turning. "We are not running a waiting room, Sergeant." But even as he said it, something shifted behind him, not loud, not dramatic, just a change in presence, like a shadow crossing the edge of vision. Hayes noticed first his posture, straightening almost instinctively as he looked past Brooks, and what he saw made his chest tighten. Colonel James Whitaker was walking toward them. No escort, no announcement, his steps measured, controlled, the kind of movement that did not ask for attention but received it anyway. Brooks had not seen him yet, his focus still locked on the old man, still holding on to the certainty that this was his situation to resolve. And the old man, William Carter, did not look at the colonel as he approached, did not react at all, as if the arrival changed nothing, as if he had already accounted for it long before it happened. The distance closed slowly, each step deliberate, the colonel's gaze fixed not on Brooks, not on Hayes, but on Carter, studying him with a quiet intensity that carried weight without force. Hayes stepped back half a pace, not ordered, just instinct, making space for something he could feel, but not yet define. Brooks finally sensed it, the shift in the air, the subtle change in the posture of everyone around him, and he turned, just enough to see the colonel approaching, his expression tightening slightly as he straightened his own stance, releasing his grip from Carter's arm. Without fully realizing he had done it, "Sir," Brooks said quickly, voice snapping back into formality. "This individual is in a restricted area without clearance. I was in the process of escorting him off base." The explanation came out fast, efficient, an attempt to re-establish control, but the colonel did not respond immediately. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes still on Carter, scanning, measuring. And for a moment, no one spoke, The silence settled again, heavier now, more defined, as if the entire space was waiting for a single piece to fall into place. And then the colonel's gaze shifted slightly, catching the edge of the worn leather pouch, the frayed seam, the subtle mark near the clasp, something so small most would miss it entirely. But not him, not someone who had spent years cataloging details that others overlooked. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did, recognition, sharp and immediate. And in that instant, everything that had seemed unclear a moment ago began to align in a way that would soon make sense to everyone standing there, even if they were not ready for it. Yet Colonel Whitaker did not raise his voice, did not acknowledge the explanation immediately. He simply took one slow step closer, his boots making a dull, controlled sound against the concrete. And for a moment it felt as if the entire base had narrowed down to the space between him and the old man. His eyes remained fixed on William Carter, studying him with a precision that came from years of command, years of recognizing what could not be written in any report. Brooks stood rigid beside them, waiting for confirmation, for correction, for something that would justify the authority he had already exercised. But it did not come, not the way he expected. The colonel's gaze dropped briefly, just enough to settle on the worn leather pouch again, the frayed edge, the faint discoloration near the clasp, a detail so small it would mean nothing to anyone else. But here, now, it carried weight, and when his eyes lifted again, there was no uncertainty left in them, only quiet recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. "Lieutenant," Whitaker said finally, his voice calm, level, but carrying a depth that cut through the air more effectively than any raised command. Brooks straightened even further. "Sir," he responded, ready, expecting instruction, correction, anything that would bring the situation back into clear structure. But the colonel did not look at him right away. He kept his attention on Carter for one more second, as if confirming something only he could see. And then, without urgency, without force, he spoke. "Do you know who this man is?" The question landed without emphasis, no accusation, no anger, just a simple inquiry. But it shifted everything. Brooks blinked once, caught off guard. "No, sir," he answered, hesitation creeping into his tone for the first time. The colonel nodded slightly, not disappointed, not surprised, just acknowledging the gap that now existed. "That is the problem," he said quietly. And then he turned just enough to face Brooks fully, his posture unchanged, his expression steady. "You are looking at a man who stood his ground when communications failed, when visibility dropped to near zero, when every system we rely on today was not available." The words came measured, deliberate, not a speech, not a story, just fragments of truth placed exactly where they needed to be. Brooks did not move, his mind trying to catch up, trying to place the context, to understand why this mattered here, now. He held a position that kept 42 men from being cut off. Whitaker continued, his voice never rising, never shifting from that controlled cadence. Not because he was ordered to, but because he understood what would happen if he did not. The air seemed to tighten. Again, not with tension, but with realization. Hayes felt it first, the weight of the words settling into place, turning the moment from confusion into clarity. Brooks felt it next, a slow, uncomfortable shift as the certainty he had held on to began to break apart, piece by piece. He glanced at Carter again, really looked this time, not at the clothes, not at the age, but at the stillness, the composure, the quiet presence that now made sense in a way it had not before. The colonel stepped slightly to the side, not blocking, not commanding, just creating space. "You are not escorting him anywhere," he said, still calm, still controlled. "You are standing in front of someone who has already done more for this uniform than most will ever understand." There was no anger in the statement, no reprimand, and somehow that made it heavier. Brooks' shoulders lowered just a fraction, his grip fully released now, his stance shifting without conscious thought. And in that silence, William Carter finally moved, not dramatically, not with any sign of acknowledgement. He simply stepped forward, passing between them with the same quiet presence he had held from the beginning, as if nothing had changed at all. But everything had, and no one there would see him the same way again. No one spoke after he passed. Not immediately, not even out of habit, Because something in the air had changed in a way that made words feel unnecessary, Lieutenant Brooks remained where he stood, his posture still upright, but no longer rigid, as if the structure he had relied on moments ago had quietly shifted beneath him. His eyes followed William Carter without meaning to, tracking the slow, steady movement across the tarmac, every step unhurried, every motion precise in a way that did not draw attention but held it anyway. Sergeant Hayes exhaled softly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, his gaze moving from Carter to the colonel and back again, trying to reconcile what he had just heard with what he had just seen, because the two did not seem to belong together at first glance, and yet now they fit perfectly. Colonel Whitaker did not move right away. He remained where he was, watching Carter with a quiet focus that carried no urgency, no need to intervene, only a measured acknowledgement. As if this moment had already reached its intended end, Brooks shifted his weight slightly, the sound of his boot against the concrete louder than it should have been in the silence. "Sir," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the edge it had carried before. "I was not aware." The words came out carefully, not as an excuse, but as an admission. The colonel turned his head just enough to look at him, his expression unchanged, calm, steady. "That is clear," he replied, not unkindly, but without softening the truth. Brooks nodded once, absorbing it, understanding now that awareness was not something that could be assumed. It had to be earned, and sometimes it arrived too late to prevent a mistake. Hayes glanced again at the leather pouch as Carter moved farther away, the small object now carrying more weight than anything else on the field. He could almost see the years pressed into it, the moments it had survived, the places it had been carried through, none of them visible, all of them present. "Sir," Hayes said quietly, directing his question to the colonel this time. "Why is he here?" Whitaker's gaze followed Carter for another second before he answered. "Because he was asked." The simplicity of the response landed heavier than a detailed explanation ever could. Hayes nodded slowly, accepting it without pressing further, because some answers did not need to be expanded to be understood. Brooks watched Carter reach the edge of the restricted zone. No one stopping him now, no one questioning his presence. And something about that contrast stayed with him. The difference between how quickly he had judged and how little he had actually known. The colonel took a slow step forward, then another, as if considering whether to follow. But he stopped, choosing instead to remain where he was, allowing Carter to continue without interruption. "There are things," Whitaker said after a moment, his voice carrying just enough for both men to hear, "that do not show up on records the way you expect them to." Brooks listened, his focus sharp now, every word settling deeper than it would have an hour earlier. "And there are people," the colonel continued, "who carry more history in silence than most do in a lifetime of reports." Hayes felt that settle in his chest, a quiet weight that did not demand attention, but stayed with him all the same. Carter did not look back, not once. He moved forward with the same steady pace, disappearing gradually into the larger space of the base, becoming just another figure at a distance, and yet somehow more than that. Brooks lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, the line of his shoulders different now, less rigid, more grounded, as if something had shifted internally that no one else could see but everyone could feel. And behind him, the flags moved again in the wind, sharp, precise, marking the moment without announcing it, as the space returned to motion, but not to what it had been before. The sound of the bass slowly returned, not all at once, but in layers, a distant engine winding up, boots moving across concrete, quiet radio chatter slipping back into the air as if nothing unusual had happened. And yet for the three men standing there, nothing felt the same. Lieutenant Brooks remained still for a moment longer before finally stepping back, his hand dropping fully to his side, the place where he had held Carter's arm, now feeling strangely empty, not just physically, but in a way he could not quite define. Sergeant Hayes watched him carefully, noticing the shift, the subtle change. In posture, in expression, in the way Brooks now looked out across the tarmac as if seeing it differently than before, not just as a controlled environment, but as a place layered with things unseen, unspoken. Colonel Whitaker turned slightly, his attention moving away from the direction Carter had gone and settling back on the two men beside him, his presence still calm, still measured, but carrying that same quiet authority that had redirected everything without force. You did what you were trained to do, the colonel said, his voice even, not offering comfort, but not condemning either. Brooks nodded once, accepting that without relief, because he understood now that following procedure was not always the same as understanding context. But training does not account for everything, Whitaker added, his eyes steady on Brooks, making sure the point settled where it needed to. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, listening, aware that this was not just correction. It was something more, something meant to last beyond the moment. Out here, the colonel continued, gesturing lightly across the wide expanse of the base, the hangars, the aircraft, the ordered structure of it all. You will meet people who do not look like what they have done. Brooks followed the gesture with his eyes, taking in the same view he had seen 100 times before, yet now it felt different, like a surface he had only just realized had depth beneath it. And if you rely only on what you see, Whitaker said, you will miss what matters. The words were simple, but they landed with precision. Brooks inhaled slowly, the lesson settling deeper than any formal briefing ever had. Hayes glanced again toward where Carter had disappeared, now completely out of sight, yet somehow still present in the space he had left behind. Sir, Hayes said after a moment, his tone respectful but curious. Will we see him again? Whitaker paused, just briefly, considering the question, his gaze drifting toward the far end of the base where the sunlight caught the edges of distant structures. That depends, he answered, his voice quiet, almost reflective, on whether he chooses to come back. There was no further explanation, no elaboration, just that, and it was enough. Brooks lowered his gaze for a second, then lifted it again, a new awareness settling into his expression, not uncertainty, but a kind of recalibration, as if he were adjusting to a wider understanding of the world he operated in, one that extended beyond rank, beyond appearance, beyond the immediate clarity of orders and boundaries. The wind moved again, stronger this time, pulling at uniforms, snapping the flags with a sharper sound. And Brooks turned slightly toward it, watching as the fabric held firm against the pull, steady, grounded, and for a moment, he understood something without needing it to be explained. Not everything could be measured. Not everything could be identified at a glance. Some things had to be recognized, and that recognition came not from authority, but from awareness. Colonel Whitaker stepped back, his role in the moment complete, leaving the space to settle on its own. Hayes remained where he was, silent, thoughtful, while Brooks stood just a second longer before finally moving, not back into routine, but forward into something quieter, more deliberate, as the base resumed its rhythm around them. Unchanged on the surface, but no longer the same beneath it. The day did not stop for what had happened. It never did. Schedules remained in motion. Vehicles crossed the tarmac. Distant commands echoed across the base. But for Lieutenant Brooks, something had shifted in a way that did not reset with routine. He moved through the next hour on instinct, checking positions, responding to calls, acknowledging updates. Yet a part of his attention remained fixed on the space where William Carter had walked through, as if that moment had left a mark not on the ground, but somewhere deeper. Sergeant Hayes noticed it in the way Brooks paused slightly before giving an order, in the way his eyes lingered longer on the people around him, not questioning authority, but recalibrating how he understood it. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the structures, the sharp lines of the base softening into something quieter, more reflective, and it was near the far edge of the perimeter, beyond the main activity, that Brooks saw him again, not clearly at first, just a figure near a maintenance hangar, standing still beside an older aircraft that had not flown in years, its surface dulled by time but still intact, as if it had been preserved rather than forgotten. Brooks slowed his pace without realizing it, his focus narrowing, and there he was, William Carter, standing close to the aircraft, his hand resting lightly against the metal, not inspecting it, not analyzing, just touching it as if confirming something only he could feel. The wind moved gently across the open space, carrying with it the faint scent of oil and sun-warmed steel. Carter's posture remained the same, steady, grounded, his presence blending into the environment in a way that made him easy to overlook unless you were looking for him. Brooks stopped several yards away, not approaching, not interrupting, simply observing, because something told him that stepping closer without reason would break the quiet weight of the moment. Hayes arrived a few seconds later, following Brooks' line of sight, his expression tightening slightly as he recognized the scene. Neither of them spoke, neither needed to, because what they were seeing did not require explanation. It required awareness. Carter's hand moved slowly along the edge of the aircraft, tracing a line that had likely been worn by time, or perhaps by memory. His eyes focused on a specific point near the panel, something small, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, and for a brief second, his gaze shifted, not outward, but inward, as if the present had thinned just enough for something else to surface. Not a full memory, not a clear image, just fragments, a sound, a rhythm, the low steady hum of rotors cutting through thick air, the weight of heat pressing against skin, the distant crackle of a radio signal struggling to hold connection. And then it was gone, just as quickly, leaving him standing exactly where he was, unchanged on the surface, but carrying something deeper beneath it. Brooks felt a quiet tension in his chest, not discomfort, but recognition, the understanding that what he had dismissed earlier was now unfolding in front of him in a way he could not ignore. Colonel Whitaker's words echoed faintly in his mind, not as instruction, but as context, and for the first time, Brooks understood that what made a place like this function was not just structure, not just rank, but the unseen weight carried by those who had been there before. Carter stepped back slightly from the aircraft, his hand falling to his side, his posture unchanged, and without looking back, without acknowledging the two men. Watching from a distance, he turned and began to walk again, steady, unhurried, moving along the edge of the base as if following a path only he recognized. Brooks remained where he was, watching until the figure grew smaller against the fading light, and even as the distance increased, the presence did not fade. It stayed, settled into the space in a way that would not easily leave, because now, it had been seen the light continued to fade, stretching shadows across the base until shapes became silhouettes and details softened into outlines. And still Lieutenant Brooks stood there longer than he needed to, watching the direction William Carter had gone, as if expecting something more, some final confirmation, but none came. Only the steady rhythm of a place returning to its routine. Sergeant Hayes shifted beside him, glancing once more toward the old aircraft, then back toward Brooks. "You see it now," Hayes said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement. Brooks did not answer right away, his eyes still fixed on the distance. But there was no hesitation in his posture anymore, no uncertainty, only a quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed. "I saw enough," he said finally, his voice low, measured, and for a moment neither of them spoke again. The silence no longer heavy, but settled, like something understood without needing to be explained further. Across the base, lights began to flicker on one by one, small pools of white cutting through the deepening dusk, outlining structures, vehicles, pathways, and in that shifting light, Brooks turned slightly, his attention drawn back toward the center of operations, where movement continued, where decisions still had to be made. But this time, he did not move immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted back once more, toward the far edge, toward the path Carter had taken, and in that moment, something else became clear, something that had not been said, not directly, but had been present all along. Carter had not come there by accident, not to wander, not to observe, but for a reason, one that had not been explained, and that absence now felt intentional. Hayes seemed to pick up on the same thought, his brow tightening slightly as he followed Brooks' line of sight. "You think he is done here?" Hayes asked, keeping his tone neutral. Brooks shook his head once, slowly. "No," he replied, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. "People like that do not just show up without a purpose." The words hung in the air between them, quiet but certain, and for a brief moment, both men stood there, considering what that might mean. The base around them continued its rhythm, unaware, unchanged on the surface, but beneath it, something had shifted, something subtle but real. Colonel Whitaker stood at a distance now, partially obscured by the structure of a nearby hangar, his posture still, his gaze directed toward the same horizon Brooks had been watching, as if he too understood that the moment had not ended, only paused. The wind moved again, stronger this time, carrying with it a low hum from the far side of the base. Something mechanical, something distant. Brooks turned his head slightly, listening, not reacting, just registering, the kind of awareness that had not been there before. And then, almost without thinking, he stepped forward, not toward routine, not back into the expected path, but in the direction Carter had taken earlier. Hayes followed without question, his pace matching, not out of obligation, but because something told him the same thing, that whatever had started was not finished, not yet. The lights along the perimeter cast long, narrow beams across the ground, guiding their path without directing it. And somewhere ahead, beyond what they could clearly see, there was movement again, subtle, almost hidden by distance, a figure passing briefly between two structures before disappearing once more. Brooks slowed slightly, his focus sharpening, not with urgency, but with intent, because now he understood that this was no longer about authority or procedure. It was about recognition, about seeing what others would miss. And for the first time since the moment began, he was ready to follow it wherever it led. The distance between them closed slowly, not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet inevitability. Lieutenant Brooks and Sergeant Hayes moving through the dimming light with measured steps, their boots landing softer now, as if instinctively aware that whatever waited ahead did not need to be disturbed. The figure appeared again, clearer this time, standing near the far edge of the base where the lights faded into darkness. William Carter had stopped beside a narrow service road that led beyond the perimeter, not crossing it, not leaving, just standing there as if marking a boundary only he recognized. Brooks slowed several yards behind him, not approaching too close, not calling out. The wind moved steadily across the open ground, carrying a low hum from distant equipment and the faint rustle of flags somewhere behind them. Carter did not turn, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a small acknowledgement without movement, as if he had known they were there long before they arrived. Hayes stopped beside Brooks, both men holding position, the silence between them now deliberate, chosen, because anything spoken too soon would feel misplaced. After a few seconds, Carter's voice came, low, steady, not loud, but clear enough to reach them without effort. "You followed," he said, not asking, simply stating. Brooks glanced at Hayes for a fraction of a second, then back at Carter. "Yes, sir," he replied, the title coming naturally this time, without hesitation, without doubt. Carter nodded once, still not turning fully, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the road, beyond the visible limits of the base. "Good," he said, and there was something in that word that carried more than approval, something measured, something intentional. Brooks took a step closer, just one, enough to bridge the space without closing it entirely. "Sir," he said carefully, "Colonel Whitaker mentioned you were asked to come here." Carter finally turned slightly, not all the way, just enough for the fading light to catch his face, lined with years but steady, composed. "He did," Carter replied, his voice unchanged. Brooks held his gaze, waiting, not pressing, just giving the moment space to continue. Carter looked back toward the base, toward the structures now lit against the darkening sky, his eyes tracing something unseen, something remembered. "There is something here that does not belong to your records," he said, each word placed with quiet precision. Hayes felt a subtle tension return, not fear, not concern, but awareness, the kind that sharpened focus. Brooks listened without interruption, his attention fixed. "Something that was left behind," Carter continued, "not by mistake, and not for everyone to find." The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the ground, carrying the sound of distant movement that seemed to echo the weight of his words. Brooks felt it then, not as confusion, but as realization, that this was not the end of the moment that had started hours ago. It was the beginning of something else, something that extended beyond what he had understood before. "Why us?" Hayes asked quietly, his voice respectful, measured. Carter's eyes shifted toward him briefly, then back to Brooks. "Because you stopped," he said, "even if it was late." The words were not harsh, not critical, just honest. Brooks accepted them without flinching, because he understood now what they meant. Carter stepped back slightly, turning more fully toward the road, the boundary still unbroken. "What comes next is not written down," he said, his voice lower now, almost blending with the wind. "And it is not explained twice." Brooks nodded once, The weight of that settling into place. No orders, no briefing. Just understanding. Carter took one final look toward the base, then back at them. And in that moment, there was no rank, no distance, only recognition. If you are going to follow, he said quietly, then you follow for the right reasons. He turned then, stepping forward along the edge of the road, not crossing, just moving,